Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first speaker session on Inner Climate Academy's Emerging Leaders Forum. I am so excited this morning, and we have our speakers here today already joined us. We have Ashish Kothari joining us from Pune, Maharashtra in India, and Danielle Celermajer from Sydney in Australia. Welcome, Danielle and Ashish. While people are joining in.
Hi, namaste, hello.
People are slowly joining in. We will start because we have a bit to cover today. So the agenda for today is Ashish will speak first, followed by a short Q&A. And then Daniel will speak, followed by a short Q&A, and then there is a conversation between them, which I will try to moderate and hold space for. Before we begin, I just would like to introduce our speakers in more detail. First of all, to personally say that I am very honored that you both have come here. Ashish, you've been a big inspiration for me since a long time. So it's really an honor that you're here and we're collaborating on this project. And Dany, I have met you. It's been more than a year actually, and it's been a great connection and inspiration for me personally. And I hope that the else in the program also have also already been inspired by your writings and will be inspired more today. And for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, welcome. I hope these talks that we make available to you would touch you, guide you, and hopefully will also influence the work that you do in the world in one way or the other. And how you live in this world as well. Maybe it might raise questions, which I hope you will take from here and work with them. All right, so. Danielle Celermajer is a professor of sociology and social policy at the University of Sydney. She's a deputy director of the Sydney Environment Institute and lead of the Multispecies Justice Project. Integral to her academic work is the intentional multi-species community in which she lives. Her publications include Sins of the Nation and Ritual of Apology, The Prevention of Torture, an Ecological Approach, The Cultural History of Law in the Modern Age, The Subject of Human Rights and Justice Through a Multi-Species Lens. Through the experience of living through the Black Summer bushfires in a multi-species community, she began writing about a new crime of our age, omnicide. Her latest book, Summertime, was written in recognition of the critical urgency of conveying the complex conceptual recognition of the multi-species harms of the climate catastrophe in ways that can provoke effect and hence action. Ashish Kothari is one of the founders of Kalpak Vriksha, a non-profit organization in India which deals with environmental and development issues. He's a member of many people's movements. He has taught an Indian Institute of Public Administration and has coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. He has served on boards of Greenpeace International and the ICCA Consortium in India. He's also a judge on the International Tribunal on Rights of Nature. He also helps coordinate Vikas Sangam, Global Tapestry of Alternatives and Radical Ecological Democracy. He's also the co-author and co-editor of Churning the Earth, Alternative Futures and Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary. Ashish, I welcome you to speak first.
Thank you. Thanks, Lakshmi. Wonderful to be with you all, even if it's only on screen. And lovely to share this session with Danielle. especially since I began my work in in the environmental field with struggles to protect the rights of animals, wild animals in that case. But I'm looking forward to hearing Danielle and her journey. So we have Lakshmi 20 minutes each, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go straight into my presentation. I hopefully will be on time. I think you need to enable my screen sharing. So I will usually my presentation is in 2 or 3 parts. The first part is looking at the problems, the crises we're all facing, but I think you're all very familiar with them. So I will do that in a couple of minutes. In the discussion, if we want, we can go a bit further into it. Most of my presentation, I'll focus on looking at the kind of grounded radical alternatives that are coming up in different parts of the world, and the sorts of frameworks of what a society could look like that are emerging from those ground level experiments. Okay, Lakshmi, let me know, is this visible full screen?
It's not visible for me right now.
Oh.
Yes, it is now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so yeah, in terms of the sort of problem statement, so to speak, we are all aware of the fact that development in the way that it's been defined and imposed all over the world, especially based on rapid economic growth and this ideology of industrialization and westernized modernization and so on, is also been a form of violence against the rest of nature, as you can see in this particular advertisement from an Indian multinational corporation, but also against communities, especially those most heavily dependent on nature and natural resources and land for their livelihoods, but in some way or the other against all of us, including in the very deep ways in which we get alienated from the rest of nature and from each other in the quest of material possessions and progress in the way that has been defined under these models of development. And so I actually call this a movement from livelihoods, which were not jobs, but occupations that were related to and the ecological systems in which they were, and also, of course, very deeply enmeshed in cultural systems, to what are now soul deadening jobs in most sectors, and which I call deadlihoods. And in the COVID pandemic, we have seen that there are 2 broad trends of the kind of responses people have given. One is where companies and governments have used this as an opportunity or an excuse to become more profit-seeking, more authoritarian, etc. And the other is where people, ordinary human beings, have reached out in multiple different forms of solidarity towards other people who are in need, either because of the impact on livelihoods or health or lack of access to food, etc. And it's the second part which I want to focus on in most of my presentation, the part of human nature which is able to get out of its own comfort zones and is able to create systems of solidarity and mutual aid. Because one of the biggest questions that has arisen, of course, is that if we are critiquing this model of development and everything that underlies it, then is there an alternative? And I would assert that yes, there are of 2 kinds. One is where we are seeing movements of resistance, people's movements against mining or dams or against oppression, against inequalities of various kinds, whether it's patriarchy or casteism or racism. This particular picture is from about 30 years back, where Adivasi populations in central India, indigenous peoples, protested against 2 mega hydroelectricity projects, not only because these projects would have displaced their villages and destroyed their livelihoods and their forests, but also because what they said was that, when you look at the river, you think of it as hydroelectricity in megawatts. For us, the river is our mother, and we will not allow our mother to be shackled by your dreams of progress. So what we're seeing in these movements of resistance, whether it's this one here or it's the multiple different movements of the farmers' movement in India, the most incredible movement over the last year, the anti-racism movements, the peace movements in Myanmar, the movements for new constitution in Chile, the youth climate justice movements, and so on. What we are seeing is not just people saying no to the particular systems of oppression and unsustainability we have now, but also expressing different worldviews, different ways in which we think we can organize society, which is very different. And this is what leads me to asking ourselves this question of what are the solutions to the sorts of crises we have. Now we're seeing one kind of solutions coming from the system itself, which is desperately trying to keep itself alive by saying, no, we are also green, we are also inclusive, we are also sustainable, we are also eco something or the other, right? Eco-friendly, eco-tourism. You just put the word eco in front of things and automatically or magically it suddenly becomes ecologically sensitive. And to my mind, all the buzzwords that are emerging from the system, the latest from Glasgow being net zero, that you keep emitting carbon somewhere and then capture it somewhere else. And before that, even sustainable development are to us either dangerous distractions or very superficial solutions, because they don't really go to the roots of the problem, which are the structures of oppression and inequality, which I mentioned in the earlier slide. And so it becomes very important for us to look at what are the much more systemic fundamental transformations that are happening in different parts of the world, which are pointing to the real solutions. Now, there are literally thousands or tens of thousands of these sorts of, some very small, some very large. I'm going to give a glimpse of maybe 5 or 6 of them, just to get us an understanding of the kinds of things that are happening on the ground that we need to pay much more attention to. I'll point to this book, which has many more examples at the end of the presentation. This map, by the way, at least in India, whenever I show it, people say, why is it upside down? And it leads to a very interesting conversation about how we have to decolonize our minds in so many different ways, right? Because the map where Europe is on top, and Europe is much bigger than it is shown to be much bigger than it actually is, and Africa is shown to be much smaller. That's a map from colonial times, and it was made with a deliberate purpose. So we need to also even examine the way we, for instance, do cartography or look at the land in so many different colonial ways. In terms of examples, I'm of course much more familiar with examples from India than elsewhere, but I will try and give a smattering from different parts of the world. For me, this has been, in my journey, one of the most inspiring in the last 30 years of Dalit women farmers from Telangana. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, Dalits, that is the so-called outcasts of Indian society, or the so-called untouchables, are disprivileged in the caste system. As women, they're disprivileged because we have patriarchy, and they're small farmers. So even in a class sense, they're actually marginalized. But in the last 30 years, they have actually collectivized a lot of their operations, created women's committees in each village, created a federation of these committees into this organization called DDS, Deccan Development Society, shared seeds, shared knowledge, shared water, and essentially created a system in which, from being very marginalized, facing hunger, facing malnutrition, no access to education, health, etc., they now have a system. They now have in all of these about 5,000 families, not just complete food security, but what we call food sovereignty, which is to say complete control over everything to do with food. And then they moved well beyond that into look and having their own community media stations, having they used to run their own school and many other things. And in the COVID pandemic period, they actually were able to contribute food supplies to the district administration. Now imagine a situation 30 years back where they themselves didn't have enough food to what they have now, and all done in ecologically extremely sensitive manner. All the way across the world, a very similar story from Peru, from the Andes highlands of the Quechua indigenous community, which has also been controlling its very large, what they call biocultural territory, which incidentally is one of the origins of the potato. And through their own agroecological systems, also created food security and food sovereignty and also contributed to the food relief efforts during the COVID pandemic in the nearby town of Cusco. Halfway between all of these, between these two examples, is the Kurdish Rojava movement. Extremely interesting because it's in the middle of probably the most war-torn part of the world, the Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey border area, where the Kurdish ethnic community has been traditionally, historically um, oppressed for a long, long time. So they've tried to create a large region of relative peace based on eco-feminist principles, trying to work with respect with the land, and create local direct democracy. That is to say, every commune takes decisions about its own affairs, and then they confederate over a larger territory. In Europe, many examples of non-capitalist economic working. I don't have the time to go into all of these, but for instance, one on the right-hand side, right and bottom side, is a factory that is run democratically by all the workers. There is no boss, there is nobody on top, and every worker gets exactly the same wage per hour of work, regardless of the kind of work that they're doing. The school on the top right-hand side in Athens is run on very cheap, very reasonable fees, very high quality teaching, because the entire community gets involved in providing some level of free service to it, either teaching or administration or whatever, as part of a system called time banking, where they're sharing time. Some of you, of course, in Auroville would be familiar, because I think you're also trying to do some of these sorts of things. And there are many others. I'm not going to go into all of them. Alternative currencies, where you try and de-link at least a little bit from the mainstream monetized economy in Luxembourg, and many other examples in Europe and North America. This was another interesting one that I found somewhat similar to Auroville, but also different in some ways, of an experiment in urban anarchic living in Copenhagen called Christiania, where there's no private property. A lot of these services are shared within the communities. People don't really have private ownership of almost anything. And of course, you're all familiar with experiments going on in Auroville itself. And finally, very interesting initiatives on what's called municipalism or feminist municipalism, with an attempt to try and create urban administration and governance that is much more solidarity based rather than hostile competition based. So in Barcelona, for instance, the woman mayor there, Ada Colau, has been trying to create that kind of working together with each other, including with other parties. Not easy, but at least trying to, and always keeping her ear on the ground, what's happening at people's assemblies level, what are people saying and asking for. In terms of the COVID pandemic in the last 2 years, we've done documentation of about 65 cases in India, and now about 40 cases in different parts of the world, of where and how and why some communities were able to survive much better and thrive through the pandemic, including with things like food or livelihoods or health. What were the reasons for it? And I'll come to that when I look at the framework of transformation. These are all available on for free download. I'll put the link in the chat. So these are the ones from India, 5 volumes. And then we've just come out with the first volume from different parts of the world. There is a second volume also coming out soon. Okay, so the final part of my presentation, I'll try to look at what's emerging from these examples. I can go on for the full day with more examples, but I just give, as I said, a small glimpse of them. What's emerging from them is that what we're looking at is transformations in 5 spheres of life. Okay, the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, which I'm including spiritual here, and the ecological. Now you can look at it in different ways, but this is just one way of trying to understand the phenomenon that we're looking at. And these are, of course, all overlapping and intersecting. And at the core of this is a set of ethical principles and values, which I'll come back to in a minute. So just to take you through a quick ride on some of these sorts of transformations that are emerging from the examples I gave. One very, very important for us is the redefinition of democracy back to its original meaning. Democracy means people, rule of the people. It doesn't mean rule of politicians and bureaucrats. And what you're seeing right now, for instance, the trouble happening in Auroville, is in a way, in that sense, an attempt by a centralized system of so-called democracy trying to impose itself on a local community. Now, what the people in Central India or the Sapara nation or many indigenous nations across the world, or Christianity or elsewhere, are saying that we will self-govern. We are the government where we are. And that is, in a sense, what in India we call Swaraj, which I'll come back to in a minute. The very interesting thing that emerges from this also is the questioning of the current political boundaries, both within a country, but also especially between countries. If you take South Asia as an example, you actually see political boundaries where they should not be. There should not be fences which are dissecting, let's say, Ladakh and Tibet, because that's one ecological region, one cultural region. There shouldn't be between India and Bangladesh, which is the Sundarbans forest, which has been cut in half by this national boundary, etc. You can think of hundreds of examples around the world. So how do we actually think of politics also going beyond current nation state boundaries and looking at it much more from a bioregional or a biocultural regional perspective? Now, all of this will also not make sense unless there's a democratization of the economy, which is to say taking back control from private corporations and from governments. So much more movement towards self-reliance, especially for basic needs, bringing back the economy of caring and sharing, the enormous and completely invisibilized role of women, for instance, or grandparents, workers owning the means of production, in whether it's in industry or agriculture or forestry or whatever, and putting all of this together into also then looking at what really are indicators of well-being, because gross domestic product or percentage economic growth is a completely nonsensical indicator, which unfortunately virtually all countries except Bhutan still use. So how do we move towards a much more nuanced looking at really what is progress and then what are the indicators of that, a lot of which would be qualitative. Coupled with all of this, of course, have to be the struggles for social justice and equality, whether it's gender justice or anti-casteism, anti-racism, etc. And the movements to sustain, revive, and enhance the diversity of knowledge systems and the diversity of cultures. In India, for instance, we have, I think, about 780 living languages. Each language is a library of knowledge. And when in our schools, we only teach in about 20 languages, we're actually wiping out all these libraries of knowledge because we don't respect Adivasi languages or non-mainstream, non-state recognized languages. And finally, and I think I'm sure Danielle will speak more about this, is looking again at our relationship with the rest of nature. I have to keep reminding myself to say rest of nature because we tend to say humans and nature, where humans are very much part of nature, but there's a certain sort of, in a sense, of Western modernization that has come in, which tells us that we are, which gives us the image of life, which you see on the bottom left-hand side, where human beings are on top. Actually, there's a man on top and woman below, and all other species below. Whereas indigenous peoples and others have always told us that actually we're one out of millions of species. We're a circle of life, not a pyramid. And so how do we bring that back in our life is a very important part of this transformation. So the last couple of slides, hopefully I'm still on time, Lakshmi. If you remember, I had put at that flower of transformation, at the core of that, what I think is the most important thing, which is a set of ethics and principles emerging from these, either from ancient times and worldviews or from the new initiatives and alternatives. And I'm just going to put this out there. I don't want to go into them in any detail. Maybe again in the discussion, we can look at these. But to me, this set of ethics and principles is very, very different from what the currently dominant system tells us. You just take one example of that. In our schools and our colleges and virtually everywhere in our life, we are told that you have to be competitive. You have to beat everybody, whether it's for being rich or famous or powerful or whatever, right? Or in marks in our exams. Whereas all of these examples are actually telling us that no, it's the collective, it's the commons, it's working together in solidarity and mutual aid that is most important. And in fact, even biology is re-examining itself and understanding that even Darwin, when he spoke about survival of the fittest, was not necessarily talking about only competition, but in fact, mutual aid and cooperation as perhaps being an even greater force in evolution than competition. So we're looking at, therefore, trying to re-examine worldviews and looking at worldviews which have been there for a long time or coming up new, which celebrate life and not money and fame and power. So in India, some of us have written about what we call Ecoswaraj or Prakritik Swaraj, or in English, radical ecological democracy. This is a very simple concept, basically that wherever we are at the center of decision making in villages, in urban neighborhoods, in schools, in other sorts of collectives. But in that decision making, we are responsible towards other human beings and towards the rest of nature. And so therefore, it's radical democracy, that is to the roots, but it's also ecological and social in nature. And that then leads us to the to conclude that the core of decision making, the unit of decision making, is not the government, it's not Monsanto and Reliance and so on. It's us as communities, self-defined in whatever way we are. And therefore, then also looking at this balance between the individual and the collective, between the material and the ethical, spiritual, between our own inside transformations and transformation outside. And there are similar notions, of course, all over the world, some from ancient times from indigenous peoples and other local communities, some emerging from the industrialized societies also, such as degrowth and ecofeminism and many, many others. I think they're all very different. That's why we call it a pluriverse, right? It's not a universe, it's pluriverse. But what I think binds them together is at least some common sets of common ethics and principles, which I laid out earlier. So the one question that, of course, arises, it's always posed to me, is that, okay, you've got all these hundreds and thousands of examples, but how do you make the macro change happen? How does the big sort of economic, political systems shift? And that's a very difficult question. I'm not sure anybody has all the answers. But I think one of the things is to be able to try and combine, network, and create much more platforms of solidarity between the resistance and the alternative constructive movements, horizontally, vertically, etc., local to global in a geographic sense, and also collective visioning. How do we dream different societies and then think of pathways of getting there? So to do this, one of the platforms we started in India is called Vikalp Sangam, Alternatives Confluence. Some of the people from some of you have been involved in this already, is to try and actually just bring a lot of individuals and organizations working on different aspects of life together to share, to collaborate, to do more things together, to do collective visioning, and become more of a critical mass also for advocacy. Learning from that experience and combining with similar things happening in Mexico, Colombia, etc., we created the Global Tapestry of Alternatives 2-3 years back. And that has a very similar purpose, except to do it on a much more global scale. Talking about dreaming, one of the things a colleague and I did a few years back was to challenge 40 people in India who are working on different aspects of life, sexuality, gender, health, education, conservation, indigenous peoples, pastoralism, etc., to dream their vision of India for 2100, and then come back to the present and say, okay, how do we get there? What are the pathways? So that's the book on the left called Alternative Futures. It has 35 essays by 40 people on this. And then Pluriverse is the book which has about 90 examples of radical alternatives in different parts of the world. It's now available in English, Spanish, Italian. Hopefully there'll be another 3 or 4 languages coming out soon. And these are all available for free PDF download. Thanks a lot. Love to be in touch later on, and of course, very happy to join in the discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. Yeah, it's always great to hear about everything that's happening around, and it's so inspiring as well, For me personally, because of what's been happening in Oroville, I have several questions. But does anyone have questions for Ashish? Put a hand up and yeah, Patrick.
Hey, Ashish, thanks for that great presentation. And I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things you were saying about all the different languages, so all those different libraries, really, and about, so all of the sharing that can happen between these alternatives. And I'm wondering if you have a view on the impact of sharing those alternatives through the medium of the English language, which is, I guess, not always a necessity, but a reality in a lot of cases when you're working between different languages, and whether that has negative or positive impacts or any impacts. Just I'm really interested in language and how different languages talk about these different concepts that you've brought up.
Thanks, Patrick. Lakshmi, should I take 2 or 3 together, or just do one by one after one? The other. I mean, each individual.
Sure. I mean, I think we can do 3 at a time because we've got 2 more hands up. Hema and then Maikuchu.
Hi, thank you so much. It was amazing listening to everything. My question is about why resistance?
Sorry, why?
Resistance.
Uh-huh.
Resistance. Sorry, there's an echo.
I got it. Thanks. Yeah.
Michael?
Yeah, thanks for the very inspiring talk. My question's sort of around the kind of tension between, I suppose, how does one globally sort of win the battle, and that's a militaristic sort of metaphor, but in terms of the diversity that's the pluriverse and the sort of all these alternatives in the confrontation of uniformity, of neoliberalism and that dominant paradigm, and the sort of the tension in terms of politics and power in that. And I'm just reminded, a friend of mine who did a lot of work with the World Social Forum, and he was mentioning some of the internal pressures and dynamics in that particular alternative between representing such a large amount of diversity, but the tension between trying to find the common links and the commonalities and all of the political tensions within that. So I guess that question is what are the inspiring ways that you've found that can get beyond some of that, even though it seems like it's almost a paradoxical, to me anyway, question as well. Hopefully that's clear.
Yeah, thanks. So should I do these 3 first, and then we can get to, I think Shri also wants to ask, there might be 1 or 2 more. Is that, yeah, should I do these 3 first, and then we can do the rest? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, Patrick, there is definitely a loss when we try and use a single language in a context of multiple different cultures, multiple linguistic peoples coming together. And that loss is even greater when we unfortunately use or have to use a colonial language. That could be Spanish, French, English. Yeah? These are the 3 biggest, I guess, colonial languages. So there is that loss. There is undoubtedly loss. So one of the things we've been trying to do, for instance, in the Vikalp Sangam, the gatherings that we organize, is to not have a single language being used. is to enable multiple translations to be taking place, either simultaneous or consequent or whatever, in different forms of translations, as you're aware of. But also importantly, and we don't always succeed in this, but also importantly, the pace of conversation is very important, that that pace is kept at, it's not rushed through. It's not like, okay, we've got 20 minutes, so I'm not talking about this session, luckily, but we've got 20 minutes, so we have to sort of finish in that thing. We need to be able to find, and this is obviously a paradox, because we're also trying to rush to find solutions. We have only 12 years before climate crisis, blah, 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 all that, is coming to us, and of course is very real. And then we say, no, but we need a more slower conversations, we need slow food, we need slow learning, etc. So there is a paradox there, which I'm not quite sure how to resolve. But I think if you really want good intercultural, multi-language conversations to take place, then it needs to take that time. We had one very interesting one just now between, there's a network similar to Vikalp Sangam in Colombia and Mexico called Crianza Mutua. So the three people from these three countries kind of had a 3.5-hour conversation online. Online is not the best way to do this, but unfortunately that's what we have right now. And but we tried to make sure that it was initially going to be 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And then we sort of realized that you just needed that time. People wanted to speak, people wanted to express, and you can't tell people to say everything in 1 minute or whatever. So we need to create those kinds of, and there were indigenous peoples from Colombia and Mexico. There were some local community people from here. So we also had to make sure that there were people around with them who could do the local translations. So we have to just try and build those sorts of systems, because working with only one language loses lots of loses the nuance, loses lots of the essence of what people are trying to express, understand. Hema, why resistance? Well, maybe there's some nuance there which you can explain to me later if my response is not adequate. People are actually seeing, communities are seeing oppression of various kinds. Some could be very old traditional ones, like say patriarchy or casteism, and some are new in the modern development context, where, for instance, somebody sitting in New Delhi decides that we're going to build a expressway or a highway or a dam in X location. And if there are people living there, we're going to displace them, we'll take away their land. And of course, we'll give them compensation and rehabilitation and all that, most of which doesn't happen properly. But it's somebody taking decision over your life. It's not you yourself. And people have faced that for centuries, right? And so more and more people are actually saying enough is enough. We won't take this. If it's our lives that are important, then we need to be at the core of decision making. Who are you to take decisions for us? Who are you to take away our lands or dispossess us in the name of some common good, some national good, some progress, some economic growth, etc., which you benefit from and we don't. So in that sense, there are so many multiple forms of oppression which people want to protest against, and that's why resistance, that you resist. And of course, most of these resistance movements, interestingly, are non-violent. Not all. Some are violent, and maybe there's sort of, it's understandable why some of them are. But most of them are non-violent, because they're also saying that the means that you are using, violent means you are using to dispossess us, we will not use those means to resist. So we're actually also showing a different morality or a different ethics here. Hema, please let me know if there's something more that was behind your question than what I responded to.
So I was working for government, and then I worked as a Prime Minister's Fellow. I got to do a lot of large-scale transformational projects, like converting agricultural land into agroforest, fully organic and natural, all of that. But I wanted to see how it feels to be in first person, to experience everything. So I came back to my village, and I was farming with my father. And biggest power battle was within the family, like between me and my father. So I don't know if resistance would be the answer in that place. It is a power battle. How I see it is power battle. And shouldn't it be like, see, it's not about fighting and winning, but another way of overpowering or taking over. I don't know what's the right word, but I don't know if resistance is the approach towards it. See, something else needs to happen. It's not like stopping something from happening. So for something else to happen, it can happen in a third way. Okay, they're trying to overpower us, we're trying to resist, or we're trying to fight, not like that. But maybe me and him coming together and believing in something new and going forward. So that's the perspective I'm looking at.
Yeah,
I'm asking why resistance as a way forward and not this third way of, I don't know how to put it, finding a
common ground,
fresh way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, but I would think of that as part of the second set of alternatives I was talking about, where actually finding those new ways. I mean, either reviving old ways which have been forgotten, or finding new ways, which you might do even with your so-called oppressor or whoever is creating problems. You know, that it might happen through a dialogic process in which you're actually sitting together and working out a solution. And that's very much part of it, absolutely. Yeah. But we also know that that doesn't necessarily work. If the oppressor is, I mean, let's take the current example of, I don't know if you know of the long-term resistance against the proposed POSCO steel plant in Odisha, okay, by 3 villages, Tinkia and others, right? Now they managed to stop POSCO from coming in, but now the state government has brought in JSW, that's Jindal Steel. And they're coming in with police and armed force, I mean, everything that they can to hit the village. Now, in a situation like that, the villagers are actually sitting at the edge of the village and saying, so we won't allow you into our village. That's resistance. Now, at that stage, for them to say, no, we won't resist, we will want to talk to you. They've been trying to talk for a long, long time. They've been saying, let's enter into discussion and dialogue. What is your aim? What's our aim? We want to save our agricultural lands. You want steel or whatever it is. Let's see what we can do. But government is not interested. The corporations are not interested. They simply want to take that land and make the profits. In a situation like that, it gets very difficult. Sorry, Lakshmi. I think.
Sorry, can I jump in just now? We are running out of time. So can I ask that, you know, Ashish, if you are okay with that, can you continue this conversation on email? Because I think it's a very important, also for the ELF program, for us to take it on board. This is a very important question about resistance, one that I'm grappling with myself at the moment. And I just, you know, what's happened right now has shifted my views on it as well. And I see many hands up. I've taken down your name. So what I would suggest is that we would now hear Dany, and then we have some time for a conversation and discussion, and then when we have time, we'll come back to the questions. Is that okay with everyone? Yeah, great.
I'll also try and respond to some in the chat if I can.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ashish.
Thanks.
Yeah, Dany. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Hi, everyone. Lakshmi, how long do I have?
At this moment, I think you can go on for 25, and then we'll do a check-in.
Okay, just pull me up. It's really such a great honor to be here with all of you and to share the session with Ashish. I wish I was in the same room with you, and also wish I had a bit more of a sense of who's here. It's hard to speak into anonymity. And thank you, Lakshmi, for bringing us together. I want to commence by acknowledging that I am on the unceded lands of the Dharawal people on the south coast of what's now known as Eastern Australia. And just before I came into my computer, I was sitting on the deck and there were some lyrebirds who were singing. Lyrebirds, for those of you who don't know, are these extraordinary birds who mimic the forest around them. And to me, lyrebirds have really become the embodiment of an ecology, because they sing the world in which they belong. And so I thought that was really beautiful that they were speaking just before I came on. I wish I could bring their sounds into our conversation. So I'm going to speak about the idea of multi-species justice, which I think segues well with many things that Ashish was saying, particularly around radical ecological democracy. And I'm going to introduce the idea, and then if we get time, speak a little bit about summertime. I sent you some excerpts from the book. I hope people got a chance to look at some of them. And I'd like to speak in relation to summertime about the challenges of trying to write or represent or act in a way that truly acknowledges and takes into account the claims, the justice claims, the ethical claims of beings other than humans against a background which is not only unjust between humans, but that systematically excludes beings other than humans as subjects of ethical concern or justice. Now, because this is the Inner Climate Academy, I'm not going to introduce the idea of multi-species justice in this abstract way. Often when we talk about the history of ideas, we talk about them as if they just, come out of people's heads, disconnected from their bodies and the worlds in which they are embedded. But as I understand it, part of what we're trying to do in this forum is really understand how we're embodied beings. We're part of a network of embodied beings. And so our ideas and our responses are always ecological ideas. And so I'm going to start very personally by talking about how I moved from being very much a human rights activist and a human rights scholar to this world of multi-species justice, and how that's very much about my embodied life, but also my encounter, our collective encounter in a world in which the violence against the more than human is hitting us on every sensual dimension and is now the fabric of the unavoidable fabric of our world. So I am the daughter of survivors of the Shoah or the Holocaust. Both of my parents were Jewish children born just before the outset of World War II. And other than my parents and their parents, everyone else in the family was murdered. And so the worlds that they came from and that I inherited were both from a material and a cultural point of view annihilated. And so from a very early age, the reality of the types of violence and suffering that grow from the systematic exclusion, in this case of some people, from the circle of moral concern was starkly apparent to me. It wasn't an abstract idea, it was very much a material presence, or actually more of a ghosting of these beings who no longer existed in this world, that no longer existed. And so I understood that large-scale violence is not an individual affair, and that specific acts of violence rarely arise ad hoc. Violence, suffering, and injustice are always rooted in structures and relations and institutions. By institutions, I don't mean just formal institutions like hospitals and schools, and this goes back to a discussion that already started, the language that we use, who we think counts, but also, the embodied pathways along which we live our lives and develop our understanding of ethics, like who do we bump into every day? Who do we spend time with? Whose voices count? All of these material and discursive institutions. And so because the reality of intrahuman injustice was so much part of my blood and bones growing up, intrahuman injustice was very much the focus of my work for a long time in my activist and my scholarly life. And I looked to human rights as a conceptual or institutional framework that I thought was going to be quite useful in dealing with certain forms of injustice and creating more just societies. Now, there's a lot that's very problematic about human rights. We can talk about that, conceptually and institutionally, but what's right about it, and the reason I want to start with it, is that the basic premise is that to be a subject of moral concern is not just to have a claim of justice because your particular group is being left out, but to have a claim that this category of the human, that is by virtue of just being human, you have certain types of ethical claims. Any human can claim to be human within the human rights framework. And for a long time, that seemed to me like a sufficiently capacious framework to work with a lot of the injustices that we were dealing with. That any human being could basically say, hey, I'm being left out from this category of moral concern. Now, critics of human rights have quite rightly pointed out that the model of the human that has been used is gendered, raced, has a particular type of sexuality, is abled, and so on. And so that's very problematic. But as an ideal, and more or less also in some forms of practice, as new types of subjects claim human rights, we also change the idea of what we think a human being is. And I want to go into that debate, but even at its most positive reading, even if we don't accept a lot of the very legitimate post-colonial racial and feminist critiques of human rights, you still have to be human to get in the door, right? Like the door is closed at the boundaries of the human. And that the outer boundaries are always at the edge of the human became increasingly problematic for me. And the second part that became increasingly problematic is that the human, as we know, is defined by virtue of its constitutive exclusions, right? In the West, to be a human is not to be an animal, is not to be a plant. You look right through the history of Western philosophy and Western theology. It's what Gregory Bateson, the wonderful anthropologist, called schismogenesis, that beings literally come into being by virtue of creating a division from what they're not. Now, there's nothing wrong with difference itself, and, to go to the types of experiments in living that Ashish was talking about, we want a world that affirms difference, but we don't want a world in which difference is organised hierarchically, where you're different, and by virtue of your identity, you're placed in a hierarchy which is grounded in the truths of God, the truths of science, or the truths of nature. So that type of framework fell apart for me for three main reasons. Firstly, my own moral commitments demanded that I was radically suspicious of any system that had constitutive exclusions. And that meant that by my own criteria, when I realised that this human rights framework was based on creating particular types of exclusions, it became intolerable for me. Second, the same ideologies that create hierarchies amongst humans also provide legitimacy for the systematic acts of violence and cruelty against other types of beings. And when we start to see those patterns, we see that these logics of exclusion just can't end at the boundaries of the human. And I started to see that the ways in which, just by virtue of this absolute ontological divide between humans and other beings, we named acts of violence in the world very differently. So if you take the example of pigs who are in industrial farming, industrial agriculture, which is increasingly so in the United States, for example, 97% of animal agriculture is industrial agriculture. Female pigs are kept in these cells where they can barely move. They're systematically inseminated, then they have their babies taken away from them, and when they're no longer productive or reproductive, they're killed. Now, if they weren't pigs, we would call that rape, torture, murder, and the forced removal of children. We don't call it that because we believe that there's this absolute divide between humans and beings other than humans. And that just became increasingly intolerable for me. And the third reason I found it necessary to move towards this idea of multi-species justice is that the basic theory of being or ontology that human rights is based on just stopped making sense right across the disciplines, whether it's feminist philosophy, biology or physics. The idea of the individual, that the basic unit of being is the individual, is just losing all credibility. We know whether it's Lynn Margolis's biology and symbiogenesis, or feminist philosophy, or Karen Barad's feminist science and physics, that beings come into existence and are nurtured and formed and changed always already in relationship. So both the idea that the human is this separate species, but also the idea of the individual just doesn't make sense anymore. And so, you know, just to pull that together, this, you know, my suspicion of constituted exclusions, my understanding of the way that the world worked just really forced me to think as a theory of justice, and theories of justice and institutions of justice are really at the foundation of the way that we organise societies ethically. We needed to have a different ethical framework, one that was sufficiently capacious to take seriously the claims and interests, the aspirations, the dreams of all Earth beings. And that's where I came to the idea of multi-species justice. Lakshmi, can you just give me a sense of how I'm going for time? I haven't been watching the clock at all.
Yeah, I think you've got, from what we decided, 45 minutes, I think you've got 10 more minutes.
Okay, beautiful. Multi-species justice is just a family of ideas. I'm by no means claiming that this is the theory. It's one framework. Feminism is another. There are many others. You know, as Ashish said, Indigenous peoples have well-developed principles, philosophies, and protocols for living in systems where the claims of other sorts of beings are recognised as the foundation for justice. And of course, importantly, and this is a really important part of multi-species justice, as Black and people of colour and Indigenous scholars and activists insist, it's not about, okay, now it's all okay for humans and now we go beyond the human. We have to understand that the dynamics of exclusion and injustice that cut through intra-human relations are the same ones or are mirrored in our relations with the more than human world. But there are a bunch of difficulties in actually implementing this idea, and I'm just going to mention three, hopefully, before I have a minute to talk about summertime. First, the institutions, the dominant institutions that organise our life are almost universally anthropocentric. Even the more, many of the more radical forms of democracy still don't imagine direct representation for beings other than humans. We're really at the infancy of thinking about how do we redesign our institutions so that beings other than humans aren't just objects of moral concern, but subjects within the ways in which we make decisions. Second, often people say that if we bring in beings other than humans, we're just going to proliferate conflict. From my point of view, that is a total non-argument, because by virtue of excluding them, all we're doing is we're making a preemptive decision that the loser in the conflict is going to be beings other than humans. So the conflict is already there. We're just not actually allowing the different interests to play out. And the third is the difficulty of communication. We already talked about, you know, the hegemony of English. What happens when we actually try to allow the full range of Earth beings to be expressive subjects within decision-making fora. So this is really a call for radical imagination. Now, I want to move back now to, I kind of started by talking about my own intellectual journey. Those of you who are in Australia experienced this directly. I'm sure those of you who are in India read about the Black Summer fires that started. They actually misnamed the Black Summer fires because they started in September, which is the beginning of spring. And this is one of the features of climate catastrophe, that summer is no longer just 3 months of the year. And as Lakshmi said, I live on an intentional multi-species community. And as the Black Summer fires were really raging across this country, even though there was a huge amount of talk about what was the destructiveness, I noticed that the recognition of the justice claims of other beings wasn't really entering the discourse in the way that it needed to. And I'm just going to give one example. I'm going to try to talk about a couple of ways in which I tried to write about that climate catastrophic event in a way that started to open up this idea of multi-species justice as a lived reality. So there were two dominant ways in which the fires were being spoken about. One was that it was a natural disaster. Now, there's nothing natural about the disaster. I don't even need to go into that. This is, clearly anthropogenic climate change at work. And the second was that it was a tragedy. Tragedy is what Sophocles or Shakespeare writes. Tragedy is something that comes down from the gods. Shakespeare wrote in King Lear, as flies to the boys are we to the gods, right? As if we bear no responsibility. And so it was literally being bombarded with these terms that this term omnicide came to me. Omnicide, the killing of everything, right? Genocide, the killing of the people. Omnicide, the killing of everything. And that term was really important to me as a justice term because it signaled that these other beings aren't dying, they're being murdered. They're being systematically murdered. And where there's murder, there's responsibility. So I just use that as an example of the importance of trying to find ways of languaging what's happening that recognize beings other than humans. The second way was really a very personal way by trying to, and I hope that some of you read the piece that was the first piece in the book about Jimmy, who Jimmy's no longer with us. He was a pig with whom I lived, and his sister Katie was killed in a devastating fire when we evacuated them. And when he came back when we brought him home, he survived the fires. My encounter with his complex emotional way of making sense of what had happened to him and the way that he was trying to navigate his own survival just showed me, and I wanted to try and represent that in a way that we didn't just feel sorry for animals, we didn't just see that they were being harmed, but we come to understand that they and the trees and the mountains and the rivers are earth beings here with us who are also trying to navigate this world. The third thing that I'm going to say about the challenge of trying to write that is this challenge of writing the gargantuan nature of the scale. One thing that I'm sure that you've all encountered in your work on climate catastrophe is just people cut off because how do you represent a number like 3 billion animals? 3 billion animals. So I was sitting at this desk where I'm talking to you now, and I was thinking, how do I write 3 billion animals in a way that is even going to start to convey that reality? And I was looking out the window and I had this idea. What if we spent just 10 seconds allowing our minds to rest with each of those animals? And I got out my little calculator on my phone 10 seconds for 3 billion animals is 950 years. 950 years doing nothing but contemplating the deaths of those animals that summer in this country starts to give you some embodied sense of what it is that we're talking about. And the fourth, and I'll finish here, and I'm just going to read, if I may, a small excerpt, because I think this, given that we're already talking about language, about the difficulty of anthropomorphism. You know, it's something that you're often accused of when you try to write about the emotional and semiotic, meaningful experience of beings other than humans, is that you anthropomorphize. So this appears in a chapter where I've been talking about the trees and watching the trees move from green to brown and then back to green, and their relationship with the water. And I'll finish after this. I'm trying not to anthropomorphize here, but it's hard not to, because humans, at least the humans who speak my language, have taken all the best words and guarded them jealously for ourselves. All the words that signify feeling, wanting, knowing, responding, aspiring. At best, everyone else gets to react. So as long as I'm using this language, there really is no option than to use the words that we humans apply to ourselves and claim as our human affordances and capacities, but to use them in the spirit of resistance. To trust that when we give them over to beings other than humans, to Katie or to the ferns or to the ecosystems that are trying to persist as temperatures soar and water stops, those words will also have the chance to change, to lose their selfishness, and perhaps they will even have something to offer us in turn. Who knows what we might be like if we shared those capacities and the chance to define them with others. Thanks.
Thank you, Dany. Yeah, I just I'm quite moved by that last piece, and also what comes up for me when I listen to you is also a real grounding of the concepts that we talk about to actually felt experience of what does this mean in my life when I try to reflect my inner world to my outer world, and which is a central question for the forum as well. I just would like to ask if we can take a moment of silence, and for a few different reasons, actually. I just found out, thank you, Rukmini, that Thich Nhat Hanh has left us. And also a very dear friend, her dad has just passed away, very close to Ashish, and she works with Ashish also. And you also, I think, brought up the grief for the 3 billion beings that left us during the fires. So if we can take just a moment of silence for all the deaths that are around us. Yeah, just if I can ask for that. Thank you all. I'm just acknowledging the grief that we carry and we allow ourselves to feel. I honor that. I think it's impossible to talk about these things and not feel it. And we feel in many different ways. Yeah, just acknowledging and honoring that. Any questions for Dany? Yeah, Sally?
I don't really have a question. I'm just present to it all. And I just want to thank you for articulating a struggle that I've had with just this massive, people call it empathy or vegetarianism or something. But I did read your readings, your writing, Danielle, and I loved it. I really loved it. And last night I picked up Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Buddha Mind, Buddha Body. And I mean, I haven't picked it up for so long. How bizarre is that? And I was going to bed to read it. In the corner of the room, there was this big spider as big as my head. And I tried to get it out of the room with a broom and a bucket. It had fangs, and I was scared of this being because I didn't know it. And I ended up killing it. And because I was afraid, and I slipped into that it and me space. And it's not only the violence, but I think your work and this conversation is so important, and bringing in Nhat Hanh's work and his acknowledgement with such grace of interbeing, where we are, the edges of ourself is so questionable. Danielle, the way you described self as an individual is up for question. And, I feel really naive crying, but at the same time, I'm just totally with you in your call for this radical imagination to reimagine the boundaries of ourself. And indeed, this work, my work in the climate, in injustice for all others, is definitely located in that reimagining space. And also in our language and the creation or destruction and the reimagining that needs to happen with every word we speak. So thank you for your writing and the time that you've dedicated to really bring words to this space, which so often so many of the human beings just turn the page or change the channel or sweep it up and put it in the bin. So thanks.
Thanks, Sally, and for being willing to cry.
Thank you. And Michael, could you?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it was a very powerful talk and resonated on many levels with me. My kind of questions that it's, I guess, around that, it's that, I guess, is that the task of our time, the how do we invite others of our species to extend this empathy to the non-human other. And I remembered a time in my life when I was working in Environment Victoria, and we were organising this sort of rally, and I was going through all the groups, calling up different groups, and I found there's a group called Dogs Victoria, which was a lot larger than Environment Victoria, and it represented all the dog owners, and it just really struck me because of this one species that has had a long period of, I suppose, intermingling with our species, and the depth of empathy and compassion and ties with this one species, the dog, and then I was sitting in this group that's trying to represent all of it. And it was just that tension between the sort of human limitation of being able to just know the other in a deep one way, as opposed to the complexities of an ecosystem and all of that, which I really struggle with myself in embodied sense, even though I get it intellectually. So I guess, yeah, I guess I'm just wondering maybe what inspires you about glimmers of hope in that direction, because it's been quite depressing me for a long time. So yeah, I'd just be really interested in if there's any glimmers that you could share around that. Hopefully that's clear.
Yeah, I think we'll take a couple of more questions. Dany, is that good? Yeah, okay. Chandramouli and then Yamini.
Thank you, Lakshmi and Ashish and Dany. Thank you for creating the moment of silence. I really appreciated it, because if it were not for Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings, I might not be doing this work. Really inspired. And, I woke up to the news today morning, and was coming to this meeting with a heavy heart, and really helped. And my question is about, might be both for Ashish and Dany in some sense, because I think there is this boundary that we have created between us and other species, and there are moments when I see that boundary being kind of disrupted. In these moments which Dany shared, like with Cathy, and I remember Jane Goodall's story of with working with chimpanzees, and there are these moments she shares about when she reaches out her hand to a baby chimpanzee, and he looks at Jane Goodall for a bit, and then he also puts his hand, and they kind of hold hands for a bit. And in this moment, you feel that there's boundaries dissolve, and you just become one with all the other species. And this wisdom is there in the indigenous cultures. So my question is, how are there any ways through which we can dissolve these boundaries, perhaps more easily? Or maybe Ashish could share some examples, perhaps, where indigenous worldviews, which I got to know about through perhaps the academic route, right? Like learning from academic papers and articles. But are there any more, say, somatic or body-based experiences that indigenous worldviews can become part of the mainstream? Because right now I feel most of the indigenous, the impression of people, at least in India, I can say that when we hear the word Adivasi, it's used as like a ridicule, like, you're primitive, don't act like an Adivasi, like, that's what I remember one of my teachers saying, that when we were shouting and all of that, like, don't act like an Adivasi. And we used to think, yeah, perhaps that's the way it is. And now that I know, like, the worldview is much more rich and beautiful, and how can we bring that worldview, maybe through stories, and if there are any examples where that's happening, I think that would be good to hear about.
Thank you, Chandramouli. And I just realized that I didn't pick up Michael's hand, which has been up much before. So I think we'll do Michael and then perhaps Yamini. Yeah.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Just first of all, first thank you, Lakshmi, for organizing this, and then thank you, Ashish and Danielle, for speaking. But I would say even thank you even more for everything that you're actually doing, and I'm really inspired what you guys do. And so, Ashish, I probably ask you my question then later on by email. And Danielle, is I try to be brief on the question. Is I used to be a lawyer, and I left literally the entire world of law because I felt really desperate of not feeling that anything can really happen, because the law is somehow, at least till now, made by humans and in favor of humans, and then even in favor of only few humans. And saying how institutions on here, you use this institution on a larger scale, but like on a smaller scale, like parliaments that are actually creating laws, we know it like most of the time influenced by powerful people who see only their economical interest. And so for me, like, how do you do your work on like defending rights that needs to be somehow recognized and endorsed somehow? How do you do that when you use the example of pigs? I've been really touched by the example of goose in France, because we do foie gras and you see the treatment of these poor animals, and like, but you know, you're fighting like huge companies and people who have so much power that you really feel powerless. So I would like to just ask more of a strategic question, like, how do you think you can go through and make it just even happen on a local level, and at some point even on a really global scale?
Thank you, Michael. Is it just Yamini or anyone else? Because if it's just Yamini, I think, Danielle, you could also take just that one more question and answer it all together. I don't see any other hands up, so Yamini, you can go.
I have two questions, if that's okay. Okay, so the first one was that I was really inspired by your journey as like a human rights activist. And I was wondering, like, when we speak about multi-species justice, how do you know what the other species want? And how do you like accurately represent that? And the second question, I mean, I don't know if it can be answered. I think I'm just really hoping for one. So when I was reading through like all of the readings that you posted, I was studying with a friend, and I kept looking at him, and then I started reading out sections of it because I felt so much grief, and I just wanted to like share it with someone. I wanted someone else to feel what I was feeling. And other than sharing, what do you do with all of it?
Thanks, Yamini. Dany, how do you?
Thank you. Well, the first thing I want to say is that I am not going to be able to do justice to this just very deep, rich set of questions. So I'll just give some indicative remarks, but they're not supposed to be answers, because one of the best lines I've ever read in a book of philosophy was an opening of an essay by the Marxist Cornelius Castoriadis, and he says, a real question is a question that just doesn't have an answer, that keeps on asking itself. So I think you're asking real questions. So, Michael, how to inspire hope, empathy across radical difference as opposed to those with whom we are familiar? Well, I'm going to answer that question in the manner of which I'm speaking. And that is, so some of the beings with whom I live are donkeys, and I share, the donkeys have a particularly beautiful house, which is made from stones that were gathered on the land, and it has a green roof, and it's beautiful, and it's cool in summer, and it's warm in winter, and we put straw on the ground. And we've had an enormous amount of rain in the south part of New South Wales, like so much rain. And the wombat who lives under our house has lost her home. So all of her homes have been flooded out. And in the rain, there's also, in storms, there's more danger for chickens with foxes and quolls, which is another animal that we have here who eats chickens. And this week, the donkeys, the wombat, and the chickens have all been sharing their house. So in the morning, the wombat's gathered all the straw and is lying in the middle of the donkey's house, and the chickens are there and the donkeys are there. These are animals who do not have a history together, right? But there they are, working out how to live together. And so what do I learn from that? When we find ourselves in the proximity with others, we start to learn how we can live with them. And it's not only humans who can teach us that, we can learn that from others. But part of my answer to that, and this speaks somewhat to Chandra Bully, to your question, and goes back to what Sally said. It's not all smoothie smooth, right? We're not going to be friends with everybody. So there are folks out there who don't like each other. Foxes and chickens don't like each other. You know, humans and maybe spiders don't particularly like each other. We could get to like each other, but it's not just about building empathy the way that dogs and humans are just great together. We're really good friends, but it's not always going to be like that. And so it's also about, I don't think that our imagination should be one of this massive group where everybody's equal and everybody's the same and everybody's friends. There are going to be rough edges as well. So politics is also about difference. Politics is about how do we live, how do we share space with those with whom we're actually not going to want to live in the same house. So I think that's got to be part of the imagination. And so part of my big answer is, you know, how do we learn to listen to all of the stories that are being told around us, not just the stories that human beings are telling. Michael, like, what do you do about industrial animal agriculture, which has just made violence against other animals so much more dire than it has been ever in history? And I think, you know, I want to answer in the spirit of Ashish's work and presentation. There are, of course, strategy, you know, strategy has to be multidimensional. Part of strategy is joining animal rights movements together with ecological movements, because industrial agriculture, methane produced from industrial agriculture is about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So bringing together ecological and animal rights movements, I think, is a really important strategy. A lot of people become vegan now for environmental reasons, not for animal reasons. So I think we need to bring those together. But in the spirit of Ashish's work, for me, a lot of it is about prefiguring other ways of living. So, you know, living in intentional communities that don't just have human beings in them, but learning to live together. And, you know, the number of people who come to where I live and just say, like, my daughter brought some friends here over the New Year break. And one of the young people who came here said, you know, every single animal who lives on this place, I have seen them get down on the grass and roll in the grass. They're so happy. And so people come to this place and they have this experience of, wow, you can actually have an amazing life when you have friends with beings other than humans, with rivers and with trees and with microbes and with you know, other animals. So I think prefiguration is a really important part of challenging and providing, you know, alternative imaginations. Yamini, how do you know? How do you know what other beings want? Firstly, you have to actually be prepared to listen to them, right? Firstly, you have to be prepared to bring them into the room. We haven't even done that. Now, of course, there are going to be tremendous difficulties of understanding, particularly as we move from beings who are further away biologically and so on from other humans. But some of it is really obvious, right? Pigs do not want to be raped and have their children taken away from them and then murdered. Like, you know, we could just listen to the really, really obvious first before we get into the hard problems. So I agree the translation problem is a big one, but there's a lot that we don't listen to that's right screaming in our face. But asking the question, I think being prepared to listen is going to at least open up that question of how do we find out what they want. How do you deal with the grief? You don't deal with the grief. I don't think you deal with the grief. I think you found part of that answer yourself is that we bear it collectively. It is unbearable. It's unbearable. It's more than a human body can hold. And I think part of it is, you know, gyms are so popular in the world. People want to build these muscles, but we haven't spent a lot of time or thought building our emotional muscles, you know, our capacity to bear loss, our capacity to feel rage, our capacity to feel grief and to feel it together and to speak about it and not to privatize it. You know, we've been so taught to privatize our grief. And, you know, I'm really grateful that Sally cried. We should all be crying all the time. The fact that we're not all crying all the time is a testament to how immunized we've become to the reality of the catastrophe that's unfolding around us. So I think that we have to be examples to others in showing that expressing grief is actually okay. There's a whole lot of gendering around the expression of grief. You know, who gets to express grief? When do you get to express grief? I give academic presentations and I don't stop myself crying because this idea that you can't both be rational and emotional at the same time is, of course, part of the same dichotomization between culture and nature, men and women, etc., etc. So I think being courageous enough to be present to your grief with others is part of what we do. Completely inadequate answers, but, you know, very limited time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dany. So we've got about 10 minutes. And I'm just wondering how to do this. I wanted to kind of facilitate a conversation between Ashish and Dany, but I'm just wondering now whether we should open the room for a discussion together, or if there are pending questions that has not been answered, we could also look at that. What do you think? Any suggestions? Okay. What do you think, Ashish and Dany? Do you, because I know that Dany, you've got 10 minutes. Yeah, go on. Ashish.
No, I think, I mean, I think I've spoken enough. So if there are others who have some thoughts too, I wanted to do a quick response to Chandramauli's question about dissolving boundaries, but I can do that late at the end.
No, I think we can.
I'd love to hear people who maybe haven't had a chance to speak about what they think of all of this.
And also I'd like to add that there's a lot on the chat. I will save the chat, and anyone can save the chat before you leave, just saying that. But yeah, there are a few voices we haven't heard today. Tess?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say thanks. It's been such an interesting journey listening to the two presenters today. Wonderful food for thought, and also this journey from grief to hope and possibility and creative dreaming as well. So there's a lot to sit with and to continue reading and learning about. So thank you very much for today.
Thanks, Tess.
Yeah, I can just share. I was listening to you. Hi, Ashish. Nice to see you again. Thank you for your talk. Every time I listen to the presentation on that radical ecological democracy and Ecoswaraj, every time I learn something new and have something to think about.
You must be totally bored of it, actually.
No, I never get
polite.
bored of it. And yeah, like this time when Patrick mentioned about languages, I never thought about that before, and I was like, well, but one thing that I did want to ask then, but because we didn't have time, I did not ask is, you had a slide about how net zero and sustainable development and all of those are sort of becoming buzzwords, and we need other alternatives that are coming up. But along with these alternatives that are coming up based on the values that you mentioned, what could be done to sort of re-guide the attention being given to these words, but at the same time, the big corporations and people who didn't care for the longest time, sort of them using these words as a baby step. So sort of navigating that, that was something I was thinking about, that I hoped to ask in the beginning. If you have anything to say about that. But otherwise, yeah, this was such a good session, and I really look forward to the other sessions. Thank you, everyone.
I think Ashish, you can respond. Let's just do that now because I don't know if any more.
Okay. All right. So, like Danielle, these responses are going to be very, very inadequate. But I put my email ID there, so any further conversation, I'd be very happy to and excited to continue these conversations on any of these issues. So Chandramouli, your question about dissolving boundaries, and I assume you're asking about like in our urban so-called mainstream alienated lives. I think there are many possibilities, but to me, one of the most fundamental ones is transforming our education system, because it is there where all of us learn what we are, what we should be, what we want to be, who we are, etc. And it seems to me that at least in India, probably most parts of the world, the education system systematically alienates us from all of this in order to make us a homogeneous being which will fit nicely into the corporatized or state-dominated system. So being able to change the system in such a way that as kids, we all have the possibility of relating to each other as human beings within the classroom, outside the classroom, in the community, centering the education systems within the community and not separating them out, etc. But also with other species. There's absolutely no reason why we cannot actually have classes outside in a forest or outside in an agricultural field or wherever, where we're observing and interacting with the rest of nature. And also interacting with the rest of nature, not only in terms of saying biological, okay, this is the name of the species and this is how it behaves, etc., but also as beings, exactly what Danielle is saying, right? That they are beings, they are spirits, they are entities in their own right. And I think that experience as a child would probably enable, would enable at least many or most children to not have this hard and fast boundary between us as humans and other species. And the same thing with when you said about Adivasis, that most of us actually don't get the experience of real life interaction with Adivasis or with other people who we just have stereotypes of, right? We're kept kind of sanitized away from those sorts of things. Forget about Adivasis, they're living in a forest far away. Even in our own cities, for instance, let's say with Dalit street cleaners, right? people who are, we actually are not even able to associate properly with people who come and help us in our own houses. We just think of them as servants. The maid has come and cooked and gone away, etc. What is her life like? What, how many children does she have? What are the problems she's going through? Most of us don't actually make that effort, because through our education system, we've actually been taught how to just be individuals within our own cocoons. And we have the class privileges to be able to continue to do that. So I think that's the fundamental transformation that we need in one sphere of life. There's, of course, many, many others where we could then help to dissolve boundaries, these hard boundaries. And I've been sort of lucky in having had some of those experiences in Delhi, which is why, I'm able to do some of this work. Not that I've fully dissolved the boundaries, but at least to some extent in New Delhi, in the middle of a bustling metropolis. But I had that experience because we had the Ridge Forest where we could go and experience nature in many different ways. There are so many different things, dogs at home, etc. On Shirendini, your question, I'm not sure I fully understood it. Are you saying that, for instance, things like net zero or sustainable development could be first steps towards also transforming the governments and the corporations of the world? Or were you saying that are these ways by which they actually also appropriate what could be progressive ideas and words?
They are causing their beginnings to sustainable or like progress and alternatives, but at the same time they're doing so much harm, but at the same time they're a start to something. So how do you navigate that along? Because if systems are systems that work, they continue working, but systems that are causing more harm than good, you sort of have to fix it internally, externally, along with the alternatives. So how do you navigate that, especially with these words that get so much traction?
I think one of the important things would be, if you remember that flower of transformation, you're very familiar with it, but for everybody else, if you remember that flower of transformation, we always try and use that to look at, first of all, ourselves, but also others who are saying, okay, we are sustainable, we are eco-friendly, we are this, we are that, we are inclusive, we are, whatever, diverse, etc. To see, okay, maybe in one sphere of life, they're trying to move a little bit, and let's assume that it's a genuine movement. But are they also aware of what the impacts could be in other spheres of life? Let's take organic farming. Now, if the biggest corporations of the world move towards organic food, which they are trying to, or renewable energy, it sounds good for the environment, right? But are they at the same time, because they have the economic power to do it, are they then displacing the smallholder sustainable farmers? Are they displacing the possibilities of decentralized renewable energy that is in the control of communities, right? So in that sense, politically and economically, they might be regressing, whereas ecologically, they seem to be progressing. So I think that's probably one way to kind of look at it, to see, firstly, how genuine is something, and secondly, how comprehensive is the transformation. And of course, it's not easy at all. Yeah.
I'm interjecting again. Sorry, Dany has to leave now. She's already stayed back more time than what she had promised us. So I just would like to take a moment to thank you, Dany. And I'm sure, it was so rich. There's going to be a lot more questions and unpacking of this that we'll do in the forum, and we might also approach you with questions that might come up. And just really thank you.
I'm so sorry, I have to go. I have a family commitment that I'm late for. So really lovely to meet you, and great to see you again, Ashish. And I look forward to being in conversation with all of you.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Thanks, Danielle.
Ashish, are you okay to stay for a few more minutes?
Yes, sure.
So if you had finished answering Sri Ranjani's question.
Well, it's never finished, but maybe the first part is done.
Yeah,
She and I can continue the conversation on other platforms. Yeah.
Patrick, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just had another a question, which is, I guess, about something that you touched on, Ashish, those boundaries, and even between well, you mentioned the class and those complexities, particularly in South Asia, and I guess from my experience of growing up in a place where I'm socialized into a sort of a techno-industrialist social sphere, and as a holder of immense privilege in that world. How do we, as individuals, hold sort of that knowledge and awareness, and work best to judge, or not judge, but sort of begin to understand these alternative perspectives, and sort of not approach them in ways into which we're socialized, but rather understand them on their own merit. And I don't know if that's clear. I guess I'm trying to say that we're all socialized into something, and how do we navigate that?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I think all of us have a lot of unlearning to do. If we really want to try and understand the complexities, the depth, the nuances of these alternative initiatives, and even also actually understand the complexity and nuances of how we ourselves have reached where we've reached, in terms of class privileges, etc., being a man in a patriarchal world, etc., all sorts of things that, for instance, you and I probably would need to understand even better, even about ourselves, and then also about what these alternative initiatives are doing. It's impossible to completely get rid of all the preconceived notions, the biases, etc. There's no such thing as an objective way of looking at the world. Okay, so it is going to be subjective. But the more we're able to actually open up ourselves to being challenged with whatever biases and views that we have, and the more we're able to work in a group, this is where actually not doing it as an individual, but doing it as a group becomes really, really important, because as a group, there are others who can be challenging us, who can be constructively criticizing us, who can question things that we're just taking for granted, right? And then we open up ourselves to having the same kind of questions coming from the community that we're going to try and understand, right? So suppose it's those Dalit women farmers that I mentioned, that the DDS in Telangana, being able to be open to their questioning. So whenever we go to a community like this, of course, we have a whole bombardment of questions to them, right? We often kind of make it very one way. Whereas what we should be doing is, yes, we have our questions, but then kind of spend half an hour, 1 hour, 3 hours saying, okay, do you have questions for us? And it's pretty amazing. Sometimes the kind of questions they ask you is that, oh, wow, this, it makes you uncomfortable, which is good, because then you start questioning your own assumptions sometimes. So I think there are many different ways in which, if you really were a good anthropology has been a very colonial science, or I don't know, science or art or whatever. But the whole recent crop of anthropologists or sociologists or students of communities in some sense have actually been able to create those sorts of methodologies which make it a two-way conversation rather than just a one-way thing. So these are, again, this is going to be obviously not a full answer. How do we question our own privileges is a very important thing. The clothes we wear, the language we speak, our behavior when we go to a community, there's so much that actually speaks to them without us even talking. So we have to really be aware of all of that and not necessarily leave it behind, but be aware of it and be upfront about it. So anyway, Patrick, again, this is something we can probably continue our conversation on with real life examples, because that makes it sort of easier. Right now, we don't have the time. There was a question from Michael earlier, which I think I didn't really respond to, about the tension between trying to hold on to multiple values and ethics and having large-scale transformations or large-scale systems, if I understood it correctly, which sometimes which kind of gravitate towards uniformity rather than diversity. And yes, this is a very, very crucial dilemma or difficulty that we face. in the global tapestry of alternatives, what we're trying to do, because it's the attempt is to try and create a global platform, right? And yet recognize and respect the pluriverse of initiatives all over the world. So language diversity, respecting that is one very important part of it. The scale and the pace of conversations is another important part, which I mentioned earlier. But the third, and I think probably the most important one, is not to give a sense to people that, okay, we have started this initiative, so we are this overall umbrella within which you are encompassed, because that creates that sense of hierarchy and so on. But to actually say, okay, yeah, we've initiated something, but you're equally capable of and have the right to take it in the direction that you want, so long as there's some common agreement on values and ethics. And then also to understand that the values and ethics themselves might be interpreted in different ways. What solidarity could mean in my culture could be different from what it means in your culture. What respect for other beings, for instance, could be expressed very differently. Now here, I wish Danielle was here, because this is, I think, an interesting conversation. For vegans, respect for other species means we don't not just eat, but do anything which harms other animals, right? I don't know about not plants, but other animals, right? For an indigenous person in most parts of the world, they will hunt and they will eat animals, but they do it with full respect to that animal and expressing sorrow, etc. Right? So there are two very different ways of looking at how to relate respectfully to the rest of nature. And the unfortunate part is that urban vegans, I hope there's none amongst you here right now which is like that, will tend to look down on those indigenous people because they hunt. Whereas in fact, overall, they've got a much more sustainable and harmonious relationship with the rest of nature than we sitting in a city and being vegan, because otherwise our lifestyles are enormously disrupted, right? So we have to navigate all of these complexities, I think, Michael, if we want to try and create the global mega changes, but while respecting the incredible diversity of ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of dreaming, ways of acting, etc. It's a challenge, but I think we can do it.
Thanks, Ashish. We've got Andreas, Supriya, and Michael from Orlu. Andreas, you can go.
Hello, Ashish. So I don't know if my voice is good because the connection is poor here, but I'll give it a try. So yeah, when reading your article, it was really very, very interesting. And it was so full of examples that it sort of like changed my perspective of the power and the outreach that these sustainable experiments that you name and all these examples can have in the world. So I kind of tend to underestimate these small attempts, which are not always so small as you pointed out. And at the same time, I kind of overestimate the global power of the post-colonialism and the world we live in. So my question is, since you have like a more of a global perspective on so many examples all over the world, if you could like give your personal opinion on how powerful they are to actually create a change in the system we live in. That's my question.
Thanks, Andres. Should we also take Supriya's, or should I just go ahead and answer?
I think we can take two more and then you can go.
Okay, all right.
Supriya.
Thank you, Ashish, for the wonderful presentation. One phrase that caught my eye in the values list was enoughness. It was a rather new word for me, and I love the idea. I'm just curious, as this enoughness, is it an innate sense according to your experience? Is it there in our indigenous cultures? Is it there as in young kids' minds? And do we lose it somewhere on the way? Like you cited the example of schooling or educating, not being education in the real sense. Is it that, or it's a new value which we possibly need to imbibe in us in today's world?
Thanks.
Thanks, Supriya. Yeah. Ashish, one more. Michael, you want to quickly add?
Yes, Ashish. So yeah, I'm just taking the opportunity. I wanted to share. We had the chance to meet with maybe somebody Rajendra Singh, who we call him the Waterman, right, in India, and it was really inspiring to meet him and to see his experience, and I started kind of getting obsessed with one question, because I've been involved in a process of looking at the scarcity of water in Oregon. But then something is really haunting me, is the fact that it seems that as long as the water flows through the tap, nobody does anything. It's only when the tap, the water really stops, and then there is a crisis, then we have to do something. So I asked actually Rajendra Singh if among all the villages you have helped to get water stability, was there any village that actually asked him to come before the water even ran out? And he was laughing. He said, obviously not. They only ask him to come when it's too late somehow, but it's never really too late. He managed always to come back. But I'm a bit scared of this. We tend to also come to some stages of things that are irreversible, and that we can't really act upon them, and it's too late. And then there is this whole things when I'm looking up onto what people propose to do, and often then comes to what you were talking about before. I feel that at some point some people really feel that the only way is to rule people. So it's like the government or the local government needs to take decision, makes rules, laws, and all, and impose things. And then sometimes they do it with really different interests. Sometimes it's for the best interest. But then for me, it's a full mess of we are trying to look at the environment and the balance between the human development and the environment care and nature. And we want people to integrate it themselves within their lifestyle. And then, you feel it's maybe not enough, because anyway, people don't care unless a crisis happens. So then seems to be a better solution to have a higher power, an institution that imposes a view or a rule, and I can't really feel super comfortable with that second option. So I just wanted to have your views on it.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Short ones there. And as I said earlier, we can continue this on other platforms offline. So Andres, number one, as a quick aside, Andres, if you're in Colombia, I'd love to put you in touch with our partners there, the Crianza Mutua people, in case you're not already, with people like Arturo Escobar and others, if you are not already, and if you want to be, we can do that separately. Are these examples enough to change the system? And I presume you mean the macro system, because at the micro level, they're already making those transformations take place. The two examples I always take when people ask this question is, there's all these scattered things happening all over the world. Are they really going to make that macro change? For me, the two examples that create the inspiration, the possibility, the hope of that are the feminist movement and anti-colonial movements. Now, if you look at the feminist movement 100 years back, most of the women who are on this call would probably not be able to have been on this call. This would have been 90% or 99% men, right? Now, this might seem like a small change, but actually it's a very, very, very large change. And how did it happen? Not with the start of a sudden big global movement, but actually individual actions by people, by groups of women in different parts of the world, which kind of snowballed over time to create a movement which you still can't call it global in that sense, but it is a movement which is all over the world, and demanding equality and rights and so on and so forth. And it's in 100 years created massive changes in many different ways, right? Not that patriarchy is gone, it's still very much with us, but there are many forms of it which actually have diminished and have been defeated. The same with the anti-colonial movements. If we had had this conversation, let's say in the late 19th century, and people would have asked me, you think that England is ever going to be defeated from ruling half the world, or the Dutch and the Spaniards and whoever, right? And most people would have said, we don't think so. It's going to be like, they're so powerful, they're going to be ruling forever. And if you then look at the early part of the 20th century, in a space of something like 20 to 30 years, colonial powers actually started falling all over the world. Again, I'm not suggesting, therefore, that colonialism or neo-colonialism still doesn't exist. There are many forms of it that still do exist. But that form of military conquest of countries and continuing to oppress them, apartheid in South Africa, for instance, was defeated in a fairly rapid span of time. So to me, it seems that when we create these structures of resistance and construction, and Hema, I'm well aware that we're still continuing the discussion on resistance, but when we create these movements, however small they are, when they start actually getting together, when they start inspiring shifts in the mind and the hearts of people, including of the oppressors in some cases, then you create the possibilities of that mega change. And I think right now we have a fantastic opportunity also, because for the first time in history, possibly, we have a sense of how we are living in one world, in one planet, because of the climate crisis. Because we know that something we do here could be impacting somebody 3,000 miles away, right? To some extent, we got that when the pesticide toxicity in penguins in the Antarctic happened. But okay, that was like one singular case. But now with climate, we know that it's one world. And so therefore, if we want to solve this, we have to also be able to unite to solve it. So I think maybe in that sense, we do have the possibilities over the next couple of generations, 3 generations, to move much further towards these alternative paradigms and frameworks. At least that's my hope, and it's hope based on looking at what's happening on the ground. Okay, Supriya, your question about enoughness. Yeah, I'm a failed Jain. Okay, so I was born into a Jain family. But in Jainism, I'm told, my aunt told me this, there is a term called aparigriha. I think it's there in some others also. So it's basically the same thing, that we kind of realize at some point, or we build in our own spiritual strengths in such a way that we know when a certain kind of lifestyle is enough, a certain amount of possession is enough, right? It's not something that is imposed on us, it comes from within. But is it innate in a child to do that? I have no idea. I'm not even going to attempt to answer that question. I think you need to ask some maybe people who look at human psychology and so on. I don't know. But what I do know is that if a social environment of that sort is created, it is not difficult to imbibe. And let me give you my own example. When we were growing up in school, we were told that if you're using, it wasn't like explicitly told every time, but there was like an atmosphere created that if I'm using a pencil, until it is this small, at which point we would call it a Gandhi pencil, because Gandhiji always spoke about using resources to their optimum, whatever. Until it's that small, there's no way we can throw it away. It would be it would be sin to throw it away. That's not sin as in the biblical sense, but just it bad. And so the first time a child came to our school in a car by his parents, we were laughing at him, saying, "What is wrong with you?" So the rest of us were taking cycles and buses, and that was the way to do it. Today is the opposite, right? That you have a child cycling to school, say, "Oh, sorry, your parents don't have money, or what? Why are you coming in a cycle?" So if cultural shifts could actually happen so rapidly in 1 or 2 generations, they can also happen back in 1 or 2 generations if we're able to create those sorts of, the right signals, the right sorts of social environment, etc. And to my mind, enoughness would actually have to come from that. I don't know if it's innate, but even if it's innate, you still need the social environment in which to nurture that innateness. Do indigenous peoples have it? Yes, there's actually some fantastic documentation on how many indigenous peoples used to have systems like, I think from North America, there's something called potlatch. So if any individual actually accumulated more wealth than was considered socially acceptable, they would have this huge ceremony in which they would just distribute all the wealth to the rest of it, or actually sometimes in ceremonies burn that material wealth or destroy it in some way, right? It was an expression of the fact that no individual should actually be accumulating too much. And many indigenous peoples have similar kind of things. So I think, yeah, I mean, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. There's actually, I can send you later also, there's a very good book called Simplicity, which looks at different traditions of enoughness and simplicity in different parts of the world through history. It's really good compilation. Michael, do people take action only when in crisis? I mean, often yes, probably mostly yes, but not only. We know now, for instance, that people are also taking action on things like, say, renewable energy. Let's take, say, the transition towns movement, where they're not in crisis themselves, but they feel inspired by the fact that somebody somewhere else is taking that action. And maybe we should take it preemptively before we get into a crisis, or maybe we should do it anyway because somebody else is in crisis because of our actions. So if you look at a lot of the ecological actions today, in terms of, say, consumption patterns and things like that, they are actually responding to somebody else's crisis or responding to inspiration coming from somewhere else. It's the same with forests. In India, we're using the Community Forest Rights Act. Even communities that are not facing any crisis with regard to the forests are now asserting that we will protect and sustain this forest system because they have maybe seen somewhere else where that kind of problem has taken place, or because the ethics of conservation have come back or have revived, where it's like become part of the ethics that crisis or no crisis, we need to protect the forest, we need to protect the other wildlife, we need to do X, Y, Z. So this again goes back to the same question, which, I mean, in some sense is what Supriya was saying. So if you expand that from enoughness to all the other ethics and values that I had listed in that slide, then can we create, and the earlier question with Chandramouli, can we create those systems, including in education, that provide us the ethics, that help us to imbibe the ethics in which crisis is not going to cause, is not the only way, is not the only stimulation for us to act. It's much more within us that we will act in a way that is ecologically and socially responsible. Yeah, Lakshmi, that's it for those three. Oh.
I think you're muted, Lakshmi.
Thank you. Ashish, thank you very much. You stayed on for far longer than what you had promised. So as you can see, we are a group that has a lot of questions. Thanks a lot, and we'll be in touch. I really appreciate the kind of, it's not leadership, it's eldership that you bring to the movements in India. And he has gone now, so I will stop talking. Okay. For the people watching on YouTube, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to stop the recording now. If you have, Ashish, you're back. I was just saying.
Sorry. Yeah, my Wi-Fi suddenly dropped. Yeah.
I was thanking you, and I also saying that I really appreciate the eldership that you bring to lots of movements in India. And I mean that, I think there is the capacity to hold what's happening, and I really appreciate that. And I think we felt it today also in this session. We will be in touch with more questions. And yes, please have a great day. I know that you had some hard news today, so I will let you go now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. And yes, would love to be in touch with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, and the elves stay back, and people on YouTube, I'm going to stop the recording now. If you have any questions, please write to innerclimateacademy@gmail.com, and we will get back to you if we get the response for your questions.